All right. Well, greetings, everyone. It is with great joy to represent the Transformations 23 conference series as we present the State of the Field session on evaluation and assessment. And just as a very, very brief introduction, the word transformation was included in the 2007 IPCC report. And since then, I think as a global society, we've been wondering, what do we do with this? How do we actually work on this idea of transformation and actually enable it, given the state of the Anthropocene, the Polycrisis, et cetera? So the field of evaluation and assessment is an essential and rapidly growing field that's risen to this challenge. And this challenge of how do we understand, how do we learn, how do we adapt, how do we navigate into the uncertain future? So we've got an incredible panel, really a dream team of folks who've been at this issue for many, many years. And I'll just go ahead and introduce them by name. You'll hear more from them in just a moment. But Kate McKeag in New Zealand with the Knowledge Institute. She's part of the Connect group. Mark Kabaj and from Canada, from here to there consulting. Mutizwa Mukute in Zimbabwe, who's research and development consultant. Ian Goldman from South Africa, who's on the National Scientific and Technical Research Council in South Africa. And Michael Quinn Patton, perhaps one of the most inspiring guides in this concept of evaluation for me personally, and I think for many in the field. And with that, I will hand over to Michael, but just to say that it's been this relationship and this interaction and this interconnection with all of these members on the panel and more throughout this field. This field is very collegial. It's very supportive. It's rooted in friendship, but it's also rooted in rigor. It's rooted in helping each other better understand the local context that we're all facing within and apply a wide range of methods, tools, approaches. But what we all know that in order to address this concept of transformations, we need to transform the field itself. We need to actually look at the issues of the criteria that is rooted within the challenge and the charge of evaluation. And so this panel are ones that have been actually navigating that challenge and moving from a mechanistic, more engineering type approach of these are the goals, how did we do, to really appreciating much more around the concepts of theories of transformation, nonlinear, complexity dynamics, and therefore developing with the people of the place, multidimensional, multiscalar, long-term time horizons. So to try to break out of the more mechanistic approach into the more complexity-informed approaches. So with that, this is a really exciting opportunity to share some voices from around the world on this concept. And who better to start but Michael Quinn Patton, who's author of so many books, but notably developmental evaluation, utilization-focused evaluation, principles-focused evaluation, and yes, blue marble evaluation. So Michael, over to you.
Thank you, Glenn. Greetings, everyone. Delighted to be with these longtime colleagues to discuss these issues. And I'm going to do a little bit more context setting, building on what Glenn just said, as we look at this state-of-the-art issues, and recognizing that last week was the hottest in the recorded world history, which gives us an immediate sense of what we're facing here. Everybody is well aware of this, and Glenn made reference to the Polycrisis. We're at a time not just of the climate emergency, but massive misinformation, extreme weather, food insecurity, growing economic turbulence, the global pandemic, growing inequities. Together, creating a complex systems interconnections being called the polycrisis. And therefore, the calls for transformation have intensified. We are the first generation to know that we are destroying the planet and the last generation that can do anything about it, in the preface to the World Wildlife 2018 report. So the question is, will evaluation be part of the problem or part of the solution? As we look at the state of practice, as Glenn was indicating, evaluation, we say, grew up in the projects with a project mentality, with SMART goals, with logic models, with the DAC criteria of effectiveness, efficiency, relevance, impact, coherence, sustainability, really meaning continuity, standardized criteria applied to projects around the globe. Traditionally, we've gotten, over the last 50 years, very good at evaluating projects and programs, goal attainment, outcomes, implementation, generating findings, lessons, and recommendations. But the field is now being asked to evaluate mission, strategy, innovation, advocacy, policy change, systems change, complex dynamic interventions, community impacts, regional initiatives, networks and collaborations, leadership, inclusiveness and diversity, collective impact, scaling, environmental ecosystem sustainability, global systems change, and yes, transformation. So all of this taking place in the context of the Anthropocene. In that polycrisis context, then, Peter Drucker has said, the great management consultant, the greatest danger in times of turbulence is not the turbulence, it is to act with yesterday's logic. And so we're facing the transforming evaluation to evaluate transformation. And the first question I want to pose to the panelists is, how does attention to the concept of transformation change the focus of your work as a different unit of analysis, a different kind of evaluation? Kate, let me ask you to take that on first.
Thanks, Michael. Well, welcome everybody. Yes, I'm Kate McKeag from New Zealand, and it's lovely to be here with you. Yeah, great question, Michael. And instead of going to the global transformation kind of level, the concept of transformation for me is, I'm going to take us to the local, to New Zealand, to where I live. It's fundamentally altered my what I call my ontological focus, that concept of transformation. So what do I mean by that? Well, I understand transformation to be really deep work. It's multi-layered, it's personal, it's organizational, it's collective, it's institutional, it's societal, and it's cumulative, and it needs to occur at different scales. So it's kind of mind-boggling, right? And it can be a bit overwhelming, and knowing how we can possibly do all of this at one time. So what my whole kind of like being has flipped for me. So I begin with me and how I show up, and then I look for ways I can support radical shifts in power to those most affected by the system inequities, because there's no doubt for me that the meaningful transformation will require radical shifts of power and decision making to actually be effective. And so now I mostly work with people who are on the ground, working to transform systems that we all know about and mostly care about, such as systems of oppression, inequity, and injustice, to unlock new thinking and practice that will better serve us all. I no longer really see myself as an evaluation expert outsider either. Rather, I'm a systems change activist and ally, supporting transformation locally and from within, using and applying evaluative thinking, reasoning, and practice where it's helpful. So let me give a quick example. Te Kunataraki is an Indigenous Māori futures collective. They're an Indigenous social innovation agency hosted under the mana of Te Runanga o Ngaitahu, which is the tribe of the South Island of New Zealand. And they are working to transform what they call broken Western systems. They don't work that don't work for Māori now and haven't ever worked for them. Rather, the systems were set up by colonial governments and regimes that have served the most privileged of us, including myself. I'm one of the settlers of New Zealand. My family and I have benefited from a system that sees us as normal. but I've been incredibly fortunate to work with Te Kona Te Raki, and part of that fortune was being invited to recently over several years, to share developmental evaluation ideas, concepts and practices with Te Kona Te Raki. And after some time together, they have completely transformed their evaluative practice so that they can, as they say, wean themselves off the addiction that they have had to importing Western solutions. They've developed something called Te Kōreka, which is a systems-oriented evaluation approach, and an example of how, in order to transform Māori futures, their evaluative practices had to be completely reconfigured by those doing the transforming, and that's Māori, Te Kona Te Raki and Ngāi Tahu. So their evaluative approach is now entirely Indigenous, and but having encountered a few new ideas and concepts like developmental evaluation, like blue marble evaluation, and those kinds of concepts, they've adapted those concepts to be more like them. And using their evaluative approach, it is theirs. Te Kōreka is the name of the approach. They are transforming the education system in New Zealand. In 2019, they released a report using their evaluative practice, showing where they tracked 70,000 young Māori on a journey through education. And one of the most significant barriers they found was the negative effects of streaming. We all know what streaming is, where we allocate kids, bright kids to bright classes and not so bright kids to lower classes. And they documented the harms that this has been doing for years in New Zealand. And it's that the impacts are widespread, but the research showed it was really damaging for Māori. And so through their work, they've been mobilising and equipping students, families and communities to drive change. They hosted and convened the ministry and tribal leaders together with principals and unions and education institutions to co-design a plan to end streaming in New Zealand. And that action plan was a call to action for transformation through the use of evaluative practice, through the use of Te Kōreka, which is their framework. And in October last year, the Post-Primary Teachers Association in New Zealand unanimously passed a policy at its national conference ending streaming in Aotearoa, addressing its removal and ensuring there was adequate resourcing to enable them to make the shift. Eru Tānena, who is the executive director of Te Kona Te Raki, said the launch of this action plan and the subsequent actions, he says, provides him some hope that they're paddling their way towards a fair and equitable Aotearoa. So I just wanted to give you that example because for me, that's the kind of transformation that evaluation can make in the practice of evaluation to transform some of those systems, part of the polycrisis, not all of it at once, but that part, which is the great inequity of education for Māori in New Zealand, so Indigenous people of New Zealand. I'll hand back to you, Michael. I know we're short on time.
Thank you, Kate. That's tremendous. It's after midnight for Kate, so I appreciate your being with us. And it's 6 a.m. where Mark is in Canada. So he's up early. Mark's in Alberta. I'm in Minnesota. And we get all the smoke from the forest fires in Alberta down this way. Minnesota's had the worst weather alerts they've had in their history in the last month as a result of the forest fires in Canada, another example of our global interconnections. So Mark, tell us how you're putting out the fires and what else you're doing with transformation.
Thanks, Mike, Glenn, panelists, and participants for inviting me into this space. I'll remind you again, Michael, that I didn't start any of those fires, but I'm complicit in a system that has. I am indeed in Western Canada. I'm in Edmonton, Treaty 6 country. I've been a developmental evaluator for lots of years, largely because I met Michael when we were starting up an institute on community engagement. And so my trajectory was forever altered thanks to those encounters. And I will admit that I didn't think much about transformation until a couple of years ago. I was preoccupied with systems change. And then, because I'm in the world and paying attention to the fact that indeed my country is on fire, and there are inequities all over the place, I realized that it's no longer appropriate to improve the current game. We have to change the game. And so if we're in the game of building a planet that's going to survive, we're in the game of transformation, unavoidably. The question is really good, and I found myself writing down a whole bunch of responses, Mike and Glenn, to, you know, what are the implications for the evaluand? And I'm going to narrow in on something that Kate, you had mentioned as just one dimension of this. And I think if you're in the game of transformation, it's unavoidably a game of zooming in and zooming out across multiple scales. And I don't think there's anything counterintuitive about this, but I do think it's countercultural for people who grow up in a reductionist worldview where we're supposed to pick a point and plan the work and work the plan. And so this is not conceptually hard, but it's culturally hard to do for many of us who grew up in a different system. Not everyone, but many of us. And the example I find easy to talk about is the work on energy transition in Alberta. I work in an oil and gas province. I'm in the province of the famous tar sands or oil sands, depending on how you want to frame about it. And so oil transition, this is in many ways ground zero. And have worked for about 8-9 years now with the Energy Futures Lab, whose mission is to accelerate Alberta's energy system to a carbon-constrained future. And so the idea that the transformation is already underway, can we amplify it, accelerate it, improve it, reduce resistance to it? And we unavoidably have to work across scales. And I'll give you a quick example of an evaluation a couple of years ago where we had to work across at least 3. The first scale is quite micro, and that was, Kate, you had mentioned this, the scale of the people who are trying to make change. And I actually wanted to find who made this quote, who offered this quote, but I can't. But the quote many of you will know is that outer transformation of systems requires inner transformation of all of us. And so part of the evaluand is how do we find out the extent to which change makers are changing their narratives, their sense of agency, their sense of commitment, and sense that they can make a difference. We did actually assess lab participants' shifts throughout the change process every couple of years, and we found some awfully interesting things that informed the process of how the innovation lab was designed and delivered. And one was most innovators only in the change lab had an incremental increase in their literacy of what was required in the energy transition. We were thinking it was going to be massive. We thought people would have a revolutionary understanding of what would happen in the system, but it turns out they knew quite a bit, but they didn't understand it from different perspectives, including indigenous perspectives, clean energy perspectives, and even having some, believe it or not, insight and empathy into what it was like to work in a traditional oil and gas company. What was more interesting is the people had actually a drop in their sense that they could do anything about the energy transition after joining the lab. Now that seems pretty like a pretty negative thing, but people actually said, the more I learn about this, the more I'm overwhelmed. And I realized it's going to be a hell of a lot tougher than I thought. Concurrent to that, though, was a dramatic increase in their commitment to make change. And they had said, this is harder than I thought, but I'm all in. For the most part, and the lab retention rates went through the roof because people realized they were on a journey. And the biggest part of that journey was possible because people found that their connections between people that they didn't agree with, their trust all the time, was dramatically improved. And the driver of, okay, we can talk about this sometime, the driver of the change process was enhanced relationship between people who hadn't talked together before, including a clean energy warrior and a traditional oil and gas person who had a massive fight in a fishbowl at one of the events. That night went mechanical bull riding together, and then later started a joint venture clean energy company. So that's just the scale of micro. Now you think, is that enough? It isn't enough because we have to zoom out and we have to do a lot of contextual assessment about what's going on in the energy transition. And if anyone's paying attention, it's so unbelievably fast and complex. It's mind-numbing what's going on in the environment. And the reason we do that is because the phrase we coined in the lab is the issue is not what we need to do. The issue is what needs to be done, who's doing what, and within that analysis, what's the highest and best contribution we can make to the change process. So we're constantly looking at the context and saying, where are the headwinds and tailwinds and the turbulence that offer opportunities and barriers for us to make a high contribution. So let's call that 30,000 feet. There's many more levels than this, but I'm going to give you one MESA level in the game. We think we work with about 5 or 6 levels. The MESA level is the extent to which our contributions particularly the interventions and the strategies are mutually reinforcing with what else is going on in the system. It actually says we have to broaden our gaze and understand if we can't assess our interventions outside their ability to contribute to a transformation process. Do we have to reinforce the tempered radicals in an energy project who are inside the system and are trying to create hell quietly without getting thrown off the boat in order to create space for something, and therefore we have to be incredibly politic about it? Or are we working with the powerful critics where we have to put pressure on the system because there's not enough pressure on the system for it to move or nudge? Are we having to reinforce the bridging innovators who try and bring the two together, the disruptive innovators, the hospice workers? We have all these terms. We literally have to understand our intervention as part of a larger cluster of interventions rather than look at our intervention alone and saying, what kind of effects did we have? There's a lot more to say about that. I think all of us have these case studies, but at a minimum, zooming in and zooming out is a necessary capability. And the lesson in that is, I think people understand it, but we need examples to make it viscerally obvious to people. And we need to get good at it, baby steps before walking and walking before running. But it's now a core skill we think of any transformative change effort.
Thank you, Mark. So as we're working in making evaluation useful and relevant, both big picture, zooming in, zooming out, we also run into detailed minutia administrative challenges. We have the advantage of being able to zoom in together for this conference, but 2 weeks ago, the Canadian Evaluation Society met face-to-face in Quebec City, and Matiswa was going to be one of the featured speakers there, but the minutia administratively of trying to finalize his visa ended up making it impossible for him to travel. And so we missed you, Matiswa, and Quebec City, and sorry you weren't able to join us, but are glad that you're with us today. How do you see this issue?
Thank you, Mike, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning and good evening. In terms of the lesson that I have learned regarding this is that the unit of analysis and the evaluant in transformation change is characterized by what we call in Africa ukama, which is essentially about relatedness, and it's part of the African philosophy of Ubuntu. It involves acknowledging the interdependence and interrelationships between the self, others, culture, and nature, which is quite central in the polycrisis that we are facing today. It also involves linking the past, the present, and the future. Now, the example that I would like to give to illustrate this comes from not a very typical evaluation assignment, but it's a kind of assessment that I led, and it was around assessing the possibility of developing an Africa food policy that is informed by inclusive, sustainable food systems thinking. So what I think comes out of that is a lot different kinds of relatedness, of connections and interdependencies, and some of them are to do with scale. The Africa food policy has got to respond to national needs as well as to regional economic blocks needs, as well as to the more sort of higher continental level. So that relatedness of scale was quite central in the work that we did. But there are also other kinds of relatedness that we had to deal with, which were around looking at the drivers of a food system, which needed to inform the development of a food policy, looking at the activities that cut across the value chain to understand the economic and social related processes. We also looked at the different kinds of outcomes which were to do with the socio-economic, the natural, and the food and food security. So that's another layer of relatedness of themes. We also had to look at the different kinds of components of actors that are involved in the process of policy formulation at the various levels. And in doing that, we had to draw on the contributions of farmers, mostly farmers, farmer groups. We had also to seek the input of policymakers, of scientists, of promoters of agroecology and food system transformation and so on. So that idea of acknowledging that there are different actors that have got to be involved, but there's also need to link with others who play different roles was quite central in working on this quite complex change process that we were invited to contribute towards.
Thank you very much, Matiza. Well, while Matiza wasn't able to travel, Ian Goldman has been traveling. And one of the risks of traveling is there still turns out to be COVID out there. And Ian is just recovering from that. Appreciate your joining us. You're looking well, Ian, and hope that your recovery is soon complete. But thank you for joining us. How do you see things?
Thanks, Michael. Let me just check. Yes, I'm unmuted. Yes, good to be with you. Yeah, like I'm back to 95%. So it was a short stint, luckily, and visiting a fascinating country, Uzbekistan. So where I've been sort of focusing my work over the last few years is around trying to think through what is a just transition to social, climate, and ecosystems health. And so it's got the very important, the need for social justice and the move to a livable planet. And I think one of the things that's been coming out in a lot of the work that I've been involved with and seeing is the link between the way our systems drive both climate change, ecosystem collapse, and extreme inequality. And so I've been particularly working at national and international levels. And on the national level, I've been working with Jen Norrens, who's on this call, with the South African M&E Association. And we sort of have taken the entry point, well, if we can, the 6 DAC criteria are not adequate, that we need to bring in a much more deliberate focus on equity and on climate and ecosystems health. So we've added 2 new criteria for use in evaluations in South Africa. And we've been exploring applying this. We're currently piloting it with an evaluation. So that's one thing of concretely trying to bring in these new criteria and see how we can influence the way evaluation is taken forward. And I think one of the other things is just constantly saying, you know, whatever the agenda, asking people, well, how are you factoring in these issues about just transition? Because these are huge issues which are affecting everything that we're part of in the world. And if you're not bringing it front and center in what you're doing, you're missing something very important. Another factor is because I don't only work on evaluation, I work on planning, monitoring, and evaluation. And one of the challenges I feel is that evaluation is often very separated from the whole policy cycle. And if we're going to get change to happen, we need to get that much more integrated. So thinking about how we redefine the agenda in the first place so that it focuses on just transition, how we do our diagnosis and design work to focus on just transition, and how we undertake reflective implementation to learn better what's working or not and bring in more reflective practice. And another thing I'm doing at the moment is I've just started working on the JET IP Climate Fund based in the presidency in South Africa, where I'm leading on M&E, and this is a nice chance to try out some of these tools. And then lastly, I mean, internationally, you know, I've just been to Uzbekistan looking at their monitoring and evaluation systems, and I'm constantly asking the question, well, what are you doing around climate and what are you doing around inequality, and how are these things being reflected? And it's amazing at the moment still how these things are not front and center in many places. And exploring internationally through the International Evaluation Academy that I'm part of with Michael, actually. And Michael's been leading on some very interesting work on principles there, which the Academy will be sharing later in the year. So, and that work is also bringing up the need for diversity of perspectives. And Kate raised the issue about power and the whole way that the powerful dominate the debate. So procedural justice is really critical, as well as distributed and restorative justice. How we can move out of this relationship of exploitation to one of an actual relationship with people and planet, and open our thinking to new ways of being and doing. And in fact, the Academy's bringing out a new edition of the Journal of Multidisciplinary Evaluation on Decolonizing Evaluation, which is about to come out, which is going to be very exciting. But lastly, in these discussions I've been having it nationally and internationally, one of the things is when people realize the immensity of the challenge, there's then a feeling there can be a feeling of paralysis. So one of the key things I've been trying to do is helping people to feel that through collective action, we can make a difference. And whether that's the collective action through Samir co-creating those two criteria, or collective action through the academy, etc., or whether it's collective action at a local level where you're working with people on local issues. And I think that this is a very important part of the equation, helping people to feel it's possible to make a difference, and that when we lose the fragmentation, we can feel the power and that change can happen. Thanks.
Oh, thank you, Ian, and thank you all. Very insightful suggestions. Let me set up our second question a little bit. So we've been talking about transformation of major systems into polycrisis, integrating humans and nature, taking a whole Earth perspective, zooming out the big picture, zooming in locally, connecting the global and the local. As Einstein famously said, we cannot solve our problems with the same level of thinking that created them. So the second question to the panel is, what advice would you have for people who want to pay attention to the cross-scale and nonlinear nature of transformation and level of engagement in order to better use assessment and evaluation to better understand and amplify transformation? Matisma, let me return to you and ask you to take on that question.
Thank you very much, Michael. My experience on which I base the advice that I'm going to share has been gathered from various assignments, which includes work for UN Habitat, the International Science Council, the Alliance for Food Sovereignty in Africa, the Climate Investment Fund, the Oak Foundation, the Swedish Expert Group of Aid Studies. I've also served as a member of the, I'm also a member of the PME Advisory Council. And through that, I've been leading, co-facilitating the establishment of the Eastern and Southern African Blue Marble Evaluation Hub, which is part of field building of transformation change evaluation. Now, what I've drawn from these experiences, which is the basis of my advice, is I would advise them to negotiate and agree on the scale, the boundaries across scales, that negotiate and agree on them, because this is going to be important for their work. I would also advise them to identify and agree on the enabling and constraining conditions in the system of interest. So that will be quite an important entry point for me, and I think for them. The other thing that I would advise them is to pay attention to assumptions, the interventions assumptions. And there are different kinds of assumptions that they would need to look at, maybe give them different weight, but assumptions about what are the major causes of the set of problems that are being faced in a particular in the system of interest. The other thing that I would advise them is to look at assumptions around the most appropriate approaches and strategies that are dampening, that can dampen the challenges and amplify the enablers. Then also assumptions around why and how the intervention is expected to work. And lastly, assumptions about how external factors are going to affect the success or failure of an intervention. So that set of 4 kinds of assumptions would be important for them to look into. And this provides an important basis for why linear transformation is linear change is not the best way of approaching this kind of change. The third thing that I would advise them is to pay attention to different kinds of dimensions of transformational change so that they use a more holistic approach. Drawing on the CIF work that I've contributed to, there are 4 kinds of dimensions that they could consider. One is to do with relevance, which is around strategic focus, around design, the nimbleness of an intervention to enable transformation. The other one is systemic change, which I think we all understand and are familiar with. The third one is scale, which is increasingly becoming important as part of sustainability. And scale also speaks to working across different levels to create impacts and transformation processes. Then the last one will be sustainability in terms of robustness and resilience to change. So those 4 dimensions, I would advise them to pay attention to as a whole, not separating them. But there are also other kinds of dimensions that one could work with, but these are the ones that I found quite useful. Because they enable the assessment of change drivers, the assessment of mechanisms of change, the assessment of enablers of transformational change. Then the last point that I would like to highlight is that I would encourage them to pay particular attention to risks and uncertainties because they disrupt transformative pathways, and also to pay attention to contradictions, which are sort of different, as they are important sources of both learning and change. So those are the kind of things that I would advise them to consider. Thank you, Michael.
Very wise advice. Ian, let's stay in Africa.
Yes. So I think starting from what I said before, I think so in South Africa, we've developed these criteria on transformative equity, climate and ecosystems health to be applied in all evaluations. Doing some process by which you bring in those criteria, and footprint evaluation has been doing similar work when we've engaged a lot with them too. So how do we bring those dimensions into the evaluative work that we're doing? So that's a key step. Then another challenge, I think, is that we need to, because the future is going to be very different from the past. So we need to find ways to make the emerging future real now. For example, I mean, I was just reading yesterday about the danger of multiple overlapping food crises and what this could mean for food supply. So we need to be doing futures work in our diagnostic processes and using this to inform our management and our evaluative work going forward. And we've got to be looking not just for the expected outcomes, but the unexpected outcomes, which I think where a lot of our change has actually been happening. And many of our interventions, there's loads of unexpected outcomes, which are actually what's happening. And another area I think is that we need to move towards much more reflexive systems. I mean, the timescales, the immensity of the change that we're supposed to bring about just by 2030 means that the timescales of conventional evaluations are just no longer relevant. And we need to move to rapid evaluation processes that can feed in quickly into decision-making. I'm training next week, for example, in a province in South Africa, and I'm taking 7 teams of government staff to actually do the evaluations themselves and training them on how to do that. And we need to bring evaluative thinking into monitoring and management. Often we give great value to evaluation, but actually monitoring and bringing reflective thinking into monitoring is going to be critical going forward. Similarly, we've got to be thinking about not what's worked in the past, but what's likely to work going forward. And that's quite a change in thinking through how we pitch our evaluations, and also how we pitch the improvement plans that hopefully come out of the evaluations. And lastly, this thing about using the evaluative processes to build hope. I talked about the importance of collective action and using our evaluations to help people analyze, but also help people to find ways to move forward in constructive ways to make change happen. Thanks.
Thank you, Ian. More great advice, Mark?
Thank you. Yeah, I'm going to pick up a little bit on what Ian said about hope. And we'll note that this is another example where the line between evaluation and leadership and planning becomes completely blurred. I'm quite I don't know if selfishly, but I'm preoccupied with the challenge of a sense of agency, and worried sick that people will get overwhelmed and lose a sense of agency in the transformative process, because the paradox is we have to be the best we've ever been and think better and bigger than we've ever been, but the cognitive overload and the emotional toll is quite big. And so one of the implications, I think, is how does one, to embrace the paradox of how does one ask people to do that and to maintain a line of sight to something we don't fully understand, right? We're kind of in this zone of change management is where you're moving from one place to another and you know where you're going, but we're sort of in transition, transformative management. How do you leave something, but not entirely sure where you're going to? And one of the ways that I like to think about that is it's actually a gift of the Heath brothers, where they talk about this concept of shrinking the change. And so one can have a line of sight to where we sort of want to go directionally, but shrink the change to say, what is the influence we have within our zone of influence and the time that we have together, and make as big a contribution as we can within that context. And Michael, I think you and I, we did a training session many years ago in Montreal where we showed that Eric Berlow video. It might be something to put into the chat box. Many of you online have seen that Eric Berlow video of finding elegant simplicity on the other side of complexity, where they use systems mapping to talk about the interconnectedness of things and encourage us all to do that. And then they say, but then focus in on your zone of influence, on where you can make a contribution to leverage points. So maybe it's just another paradox, but let's zoom out, think big, but shrink the change so we see a sense of agency and derive some comfort that our job is to contribute to one great chapter of change making, but it's going to exceed, it's going to be longer than us. All we have is a chapter. Let's use it as big and as well as we can. So shrink the change for me.
Thank you, Mark. Kate?
Oh, mute, Kate.
Yes, I'm still that old chestnut. I'm going to pick up on some of the things that all the other panelists have actually done as well. I think one of the things that I just want to acknowledge, Mark, in terms of people's overwhelmedness with the task at hand. And so one of the pieces of advice or thoughts I've had about this is that amplifying transformation using evaluation is really in what I'm seeing in some of the really tricky work that we're doing is it's about people buying into and owning new ways of acting and being and living and thinking, very much alongside the things that they already know, and so there's a transition there, and there's a bit of a juxtaposition that we need to acknowledge, and that this transformation work, it's very easy for us to get caught up in ways of operating around transformation, get excited at big levels and kind of trying to push this transformation out. But I don't think transformation can be imposed. And if it is imposed, it's far more likely to do harm. And what we've already seen that whole societies have been transformed by colonization, and that became intergenerational harm. And if we want to change and flip that script, we need to really think about how we amplify a kind of evaluative practice that actually does not do harm. And so I think my advice to people is, first and foremost, is our evaluative practice in this transformation world is relational. It's a relational practice. And so Mutizwa, I love the concepts of that you bring in of Ubuntu and other things. In New Zealand, we have similar concepts. Māori have similar concepts. We're our whole selves, we are interconnected, and the work that we're doing is relational. So we need to acknowledge the histories that are in play as well when we're doing this work, that they're in play in our present, and they will move into our future. And so unless we are able to acknowledge those histories and do some healing work, one of the things as an evaluator I'm finding more and more that we do is less traditional evaluative work and more being part of the change, as Mark talked about. You know, our roles as evaluators are transforming in this process. So we need to be able to do some healing work and listen well as well, and pay attention to what is valued and valuable. I think if we stick to the old scripts of logic models and impact models and outcome hierarchies, I'm not sure we're going to get where we need to go. We need to flip that script into what is valued and valuable by those we are working with. And we need to support people to be to practice that evaluative thinking and reasoning that will support their own transformative transitions in those processes. And I think we can do that with multiple lines of evidence. As evaluators, we can support that process. I like to talk about releasing the hierarchy of evidence. Let's release it and let it go, because actually we need multiple kinds of evidence as we grapple with this transformation. We need to draw from, there are traditional sources, but we need to look to non-traditional sources as we do our work. So I guess my advice for amplifying that transformation is it's happening already out there. We need to support it as evaluators, not get overwhelmed. Recognize we're in relationship, acknowledge histories, do the healing work, support people to reason about what's valuable, and release the hierarchy of evidence. That would be my advice.
Thank you. I mentioned the Canadian Evaluation Society, and Mutizwa and you and others are emphasizing our relationship with each other. Ian's talked about the sustainability and regenerative criteria. By the way, we're getting some background noise. People make sure they're muted who are listening in. So one of the things that came up at the Canadian Evaluation Society meeting was not just our relationships with each other, but our relationships with nature. And the movement of rights to nature, rights of nature, was one of the keynotes. And they spotlighted, Kate, that New Zealand has taken the lead on this with giving river in New Zealand rights, legal status. They're working to give the St. Lawrence River in Quebec legal rights, which means then one version of that is that there are guardians for the river or other natural places, and that those guardians would have responsibility to assure the evaluation of the health of those systems. Can you say a few words about how that's playing out in South Africa or in New Zealand, and your thoughts about the evaluation implications of not only our relations with each other, but our relationship to nature and the rights to nature movement?
Do you want me to say something, Michael?
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, the Whanganui River in New Zealand was accorded legal rights, personhood. But I guess it's always had that. For Māori, it's always had that. There's a saying from those tribes that I am the river and the river is me. And I guess that one of the traditional ways that we have learned as settlers, but Māori have always done, is when we introduce ourselves, we actually acknowledge our connections to rivers, to mountains, to places, and to long histories of people, to ancestors, before we come into the present. isn't. So I guess it's that legal status has had to happen because our colonial structures don't recognize that separation of nature and humans is a feature of our systems and structures, and we are rediscovering, if you like, through legal means a way of starting to put those pieces back together, starting to acknowledge that we are all interconnected. The heavens, the earth, the mountains, the seas, the rivers, and humans, we're all interconnected, and that they all need, we need to consider them all in our actions and things. And that's happening all over New Zealand as we speak. One of the pieces of developmental evaluation I did was around policy work around another river in New Zealand called the Waikato River, large river in New Zealand, and we now have co-governance of that river, which is the governance of that river and its well-being is now being governed by both Māori tribes as well as by councils, and they are co-governing what happens about that river, who gets to use the water, what gets to leach out into it, and monitoring the state and the health of that river as work is being done to try and recover and revitalize waterways that have been damaged so awfully over time. So yeah, so there's lots of that work going on, Michael, but I think in many ways it's the listening to our Indigenous partners and colleagues and those who are bringing much of that transformation to New Zealand, and acknowledging their wisdom, because that is really transforming many aspects of our lives.
Thank you. We want to take questions from the audience, but I first want to invite Glenn to also address this issue, because he's been doing a lot of work with ecosystem evaluation, the relationship among people and the relationship to the natural environment. Glenn, how are you seeing this?
Well, I just want to thank the panelists and you, Michael, for all this great leadership. But this is so critical, and the multitude of issues that are confluing around how we assess, how we adaptively learn is absolutely critical, and it's happening in all dimensions. One of the many groups that we're working with is a global network of scientists focused on ocean carbon biogeochemistry. Now, yes, that's a mouthful, but as we think about the future, the oceans are absolutely essential to how we actually navigate into the Anthropocene and deal with the polycrisis. So working with a group of about 3,000 of the world's best ocean carbon biogeochemists, they work on things like ocean observatories, estuarine and coastal carbon fluxes, land-ocean interface, what they call the biological pump. They realize that they are actually having to transform the nature of their work. They are no longer just able to be research scientists and to tell the world the condition of how things are. And it's through the evaluation process that we've been doing with this ocean carbon biogeochemistry network that really help them to see themselves. It's really like creating a mirror for the network to see themselves and their agency of what it means to go beyond just understanding the research dimensions, but really getting into the practical policy relationships, the meaningfulness within their own university systems. Often, many of them are involved in universities and trying to decarbonize and deconnect to oil investments, et cetera. So it really, the transformation is happening, as you were saying, Mark, from a personal to system scale at the absolute essence of research science. And that's the kind of thing that this field, the emerging field of evaluation and assessment that links to so many other aspects of this navigation challenge into these phases of transformation. how they can actually see themselves differently. So things like carbon capture, how does carbon capture actually work? And how does the Ocean Carbon Biogeochemistry group guide that? That's a not the kind of a research piece that is normally addressed. So the transformation domain is happening at so many scales and so many dimensions, and it is mind-numbing. But I really like the point of this that you said, Ian, regarding the need to make the emerging futures visible now. And that's so critically important. Think of just all the issues of artificial intelligence, but with sensor technology, we're actually sensing where there are green shoots of transformative change. We can better see these. We can actually visualize these. We're working now on what's called a bioregional digital twin that will create access to people, much like a video game type environment, but that people can engage and see the systems they're living within. So that's just a few examples of some of the work that we're doing that's related to this. But let's go to some questions from the field, and there's some good questions that have been arose. I think
let me take the first one, Glenn.
Go ahead.
While you look
Go ahead,
at the chat, because Jeff Matthias has added a question in the Q&A, and that lets us get into Asia. Jeff is in India and has been a part of the Blue Marble Network. And he takes us back to where we began and where Suzanne Mosier began in the Transformation Conference in Dundee about personal transformation. Jeff asks, he says, fabulous and deep suggestions and advice on how to see the change, enable change, enhance the change. What about being the change? In what ways do we as evaluators need to be different, not just work in different ways? I'd love to hear some thoughts from the panel. Thank you, Jeff. And if we take that question, anyone can jump in, and then Glenn, that'll give you a chance to look at the chat and bring forward some other questions. So how do we be the change? Ian, you were nodding your head as I read that question. What are your thoughts about being the change?
Yeah, it's an interesting question because, for example, I became president of the International Evaluation Academy in July last year, and that was exactly the point that what I felt was, if we were going to bring about this transformation, we needed to demonstrate by example the transformation of relationships in particular that would enable us to open our minds and create new futures. And that the way we actually as a group ran the academy in a much more collective way was part of creating that change. So co-ownership, co-creation, transparency, etc., was very important for us to allow an atmosphere which would allow the new to happen. So I think that's one practical example.
I'm happy to jump in.
Yeah,
Jeff,
go ahead.
Jeff knows me as well. I know Jeff. I mean, being the change means doing things differently, right, Jeff? I don't travel so much any longer. So one of my commitments is not to travel. I've learned, I've formed deep relationships with lots of people across the globe, but actually making a change means not traveling, to visit them face to face. And that is a very significant shift. I work locally. I work very much locally in my local regional, the little town I live in Raglan, in New Zealand. I'm working as the chair of an organisation that's moving the whole community. Has been going there for at least 25 years, but I'm working on a zero waste strategy. We're now diverting 80% of our waste. We're trying to get to 100, creating a circular economy in the little community with syntropic planting, food planting, and permadynamics gardens across the community. So we're working really hard to be a different kind of person, learning a language, learning Te Reo Māori, so that I can better understand that world, better understand that philosophy, and be part of supporting and ally to my Indigenous colleagues and friends and community. So yeah, that's part of the change, I guess, is always pushing our own individual selves into new places and spaces that we haven't worked in before, changing our own lives. Yeah.
Thank you. And then I'll pass it to you to see what are the questions, since our time is short, and if Mark or Matisma want to address that question, happy to have you do so.
Yeah, there's a great, oh, go ahead. Is that Mutiswa?
Yeah, go ahead, Matisma.
Okay, thanks. I think in one of the pieces of research work that I've done, we identified that the size of transformations start from within, like the mind, and then relationships with others. So I'm just agreeing with Kate and the others who have spoken before here that it is essentially about changing ourselves and about how we see the world, how we relate the world, and probably that should precede the agency that we exercise in trying to influence others to change. That's all I wanted to add.
Thank you. Lynn?
So this is actually going back to you, Michael, and this is from Susie Moser. So question to Michael or anyone else who'd like to respond. You framed the session with the polycrisis. That level of complexity is hard to get at. And through set of interventions, talk about overwhelm. It's also difficult to convince anyone that their contribution mattered. Few have any time for working with a systems coach evaluator during such crisis states. What is your experience of what helps most at such polycrisis times?
Well, part of the work that has emerged out of this and from the transformation conferences is moving from theory of change, which is theory of change is how to achieve the outcomes of a specific project and what the mechanisms of change are within a project or program, to theory of transformation. And my sense of a theory of transformation, we're talking here about big transformations, the end of colonialism, the end of slavery, the collapse of the Berlin Wall that Mark was present for and has great stories about, the Me Too movement worldwide, the changes in technology that we're all experiencing now, major kinds of changes, and that these kinds of transformations are not going to be top down planned and somebody in charge. So that in fact, what you've heard from the panel is that we get to transformation by everybody doing their piece. The end of apartheid in South Africa was people working inside, people working outside, people working on regulations, on finance, on education, on sports, on portfolios of foundations, that there was this collective action where everybody does their piece, and we try to align and accelerate those interactions. But the classic evidence advice I turn to from Arthur Ashe, the great tennis star, the first African-American world champion, who was regularly asked by people, what could they do about structural racism? What could they do about, what could anybody do about these big issues? And his response was, start where you are, do what you can, use what you have. Start where you are, do what you can, use what you have. That's what I think you've heard from the panelists, is that we each do what we can in our own backyard, look for connections and networks with other people who are doing that. That's how we create cumulative effects. That's how we begin to move towards critical mass, by having each of us do what we can, start where we are, use what we have.
Yeah, beautifully said, Michael. I also want to highlight what Michelle Lee Moore put in the chat as well. She and Per and some other folks just published a paper regarding this issue of different roles that the crisis can play during transformations. It's a brand new paper, and it's really, really wonderful. In terms of other questions, I think we have one that Kate addressed slightly in the chat, but I'd like to bring that up again, which is really about the kinds of methods. This is from Shauna, And it's a question for Kate or anyone. Could you share a little bit more about the tools, techniques that in your experience have been effective for fostering evaluative thinking?
Well, I did share a link to a tool that I call pattern spotting. That is called pattern spotting. It was given that name actually by the Human Systems Dynamics Institute. But actually I learned it from Bob Williams, and I've given the link to Bob's website many years ago. And the reason I found it such a useful tool is it applies to when we're grappling with lots of data, when we're grappling with streams of different kinds of data. And it uses a thinking process, a thinking process that takes us from the generalizations, the in general kind of thinking that we do as humans, that patterning that we do, we're reasonably good at, and it pushes us down into deeper and deeper levels of thinking, into contradictions and tensions and surprises and puzzles. And so and I found that it helps people to think more deeply about what's going on, and to unpack assumptions, and not necessarily solve issues, but realize that there are tensions and contradictions all around, but to be able to surface them and then explore what the next wise or valuable action might be in the context. So and in that sense, I found it a very useful tool. Yeah.
Oh, beautifully said. Well, we have a wonderful question from Francesca, and we'll call this the last one, and then we'll bring this to a close. But this is a really important one, and one that I spend a lot of time thinking about myself and working with. But this question of, do you consider spirituality to be a largely unspoken underlying human dimension that participates in change facilitation? I would love to hear your views. Thank you for this brilliant dialogue. So who would like to take on the realities, the dimensions, the power, the primacy of spirituality, and the kinds of things that we as evaluators, assessors, can actually contribute to this? Mark, I see you thinking. Yeah. I can smell it from here.
Well, listen, I'm quite a repressed person, so I don't often talk about spirituality, but I mean, I've experienced it, and under the broad umbrella of spirituality, I'm going to tie this comment to something we said earlier, and that's evaluators. How do we be in the world? And part of it is to model, I think, that we're on our own spiritual journey of change, and that's normal for everyone. And part of the transformation process, again, is inner transformation. And I'll share a quick vignette with that about that. Was working on an innovation lab here in Edmonton that was dealing with racism. And the group wanted to smush a couple of methodologies or worldviews together. One was human-centered design, the other was a change lab, and the third one was reconciliation and two-eyed seeing, different ways of knowing. And working with the powerful woman from Treaty 6, who was actually an advocate for theory of for using human-centered design, because we agreed that's one of the greatest Trojan horse change methodologies of all time. How do you generate insight and empathy from a personal perspective? And that really levels the playing field. So we thought that was a great way of introducing insight and empathy into a conversation about racism. Now, when it came down to actually picking a project, the decision was to pick the River Valley in Edmonton, which is shared by all Edmontonians, and to explore the extent to which racism and reconciliation manifested themselves in the River Valley. And at one point she said, I just realized we can't use human-centered design and reconciliation and two-eyed seeing. And I said, Jody, how can we not? This is our secret sauce. This is what's going to get us into the hearts and minds of just thousands of Edmontonians. And she said, if we're being true to an Indigenous worldview, there is no human-centric anything in the River Valley. The fox is most as important as the river, is important as the marsh, et cetera, et cetera. And I remember my poor Western brain going clunk, clunk, whirl, whirl, smoke coming from my ears. I could not register. On one level, I got it intellectually. I didn't get it at another level. And then it hit me, and I'm not religious, but it must have been like Saul on the way to Damascus. I felt that change. in my body, believe it or not. And I cannot cross any river in Edmonton now or anywhere without actually just seeing energy flows. It transformed me. So whether that's spirituality or not, these are the kinds of moments, and there has to be billions of them for all of us, that we exhibit. So I think part of the job of evaluators is to normalize that.
Beautifully said. And that really is the essence. So if there are any other thoughts, any other comments on this issue of spirituality? That was beautiful, Mark. Thank you.
My comment would be that in almost every evaluation engagement that I have in New Zealand, we begin with a karakia. So karakia is a prayer of some kind. Karakia to clear the way, to move us from one state of being to another, to acknowledge the transition from where we've come from into the new space that we're in, whether that's a meeting of some kind and the topics that we're going to be talking about. And I guess that we are lucky and very fortunate to have been able to grow that practice because of the guidance from our Indigenous colleagues and peoples in New Zealand. And spirituality is a given, and it's part of the work that we do. The spirit guides, the ancestors, the stars. New Zealand has just recognised an Indigenous holiday, Matariki, which is the Māori New Year, which actually happens in our winter, not in our summer. And we now have a public holiday called Matariki, and we are learning as New Zealanders about the importance of the heavens and the stars and their guidance, the link they have to ancestors, and learning that different tribes also. Matariki is Pleiades. Those of you that know it as Pleiades, it's the cluster of stars that appears in New Zealand at this time of year, starts to rise in our winter, and it has been a guide for many years, a spiritual guide as well as a very practical guide. So it's well embedded, and now the rest of us are beginning to understand the fruits of this knowing and this feeling, this bringing that spiritual part of our humanness into our world. So yeah, the great question, one that I think we do need to grapple with.
Beautiful.
I would just summarize, Glenn, by saying that what people have heard today is a transformation and evaluation where the evaluators bring their full selves into the work. The tradition of evaluators as independent, external, neutral, outside the fray is the transformation that you're hearing in the panel, where this is a group of people who have skin in the game and recognize we have skin in the game, who have soul in the game, and recognize that they bring their values, what they care about, and all of themselves to this work. And that's different. When people experience that among evaluators, I think what we find, and you've heard the stories from each of the panelists, is that we bring our whole selves, including our spiritual selves, acknowledge we have skin in the game, that what's at stake is the world for our children and grandchildren and the people we care about and our relationship with nature. And when we bring that explicitly into our work, that invites other people to bring all of themselves into the work, and it changes those relationships. It is a part of the Ubuntu that Mutiswa talked about. It opens that up. And where evaluators don't act that way, where evaluators separate off evaluation as just a task and a work to get done, then others respond to it that way. So we do model what you bring to the work. If we bring our whole selves, our skin in the game, our soul in the game, we open that possibility up for others and enhance the connectedness that will make a difference in transformation.
Well, incredible. Well, thank you all so much. This really has been a dream team. And I also want to give a shout out to the organizers, Thomas Hasselbach, Nick Graham, Kim Sensener and Bruce Goldstein, really amazing guys. What you've done to pull this together, this conference series in many venues, online, in Prague, in Sydney, and of course in Portland, Maine, where we're actually going to have a huge event in another week. And in fact, we have about 65 people showing up, and each one are not just showing up as individuals with their networks, but they're actually being asked to be a species as part of a seagrass meadow. So we will come together not just as a group of people to address some bioregional issues, but we're going to address some issues from the voice and place of nature. So this will be really exciting. We'll share more of that in the future. But just to say to all the panelists, it's really been amazing. Kate McKeag, Mark Kabaj, Mutizwa Mukute, Ian Goldman, and Michael Quinn Patton. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Glenn.
Thank you all. Thank you for your great questions.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.